Hi everyone. In the last video, I left everything in the end of the Brezhnev years. The economy is collapsing in the Soviet Union. They need money for the domestic economy. They're still competing with the US internationally. They still need to make sure they have a significant military, and things are in problem. So in this video, I want to talk about Gorbachev. Now, I skipped a couple premieres, a couple leaders of the Soviet Union because they don't do too much. And so I want to make sure to focus on Gorbachev. When Gorbachev comes into power, then he's going to want to fix the system. Everything we have shows that he really truly believed communism could work as long as the government actually followed what Marx wanted. And so the big idea for him is to finally move towards the communist utopia. So to do this, he needs to get money, and he decides to reduce the defense budget. What he's going to want to do is to really focus on the domestic economy in the hope that you can really create this better society. People will see it, and that will advance communism. So in some ways, he wants out of the Cold War with the United States because it's just so expensive. Now, he faces a major issue when he first comes in. In 1983, President Reagan in the US announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, which gets nicknamed Star Wars. Now, the idea for the Strategic Defense Initiative was that the US was going to create a whole series of satellites with lasers and weapons that could shoot down nuclear weapons before they landed. So the idea here is if there was a nuclear war, the Soviets would launch their weapons, all their missiles, and the US would shoot them down before they got there, before they got to the United States. And this would fully balance the power to the United States in the giant back and forth of how many nuclear weapons do you need to destroy the world. So this would put the Soviet Union in a position of weakness. And Gorbachev has to decide what to do because it is going to be expensive. Now, I do want to say that when this was announced, the idea was this would be operational in just a couple of years. Now, it still doesn't really exist. But nobody knew that in 1983. And so that is the major issue. And so what Gorbachev decides to do is to not counter this. And in fact, in 1985, he announces that the USSR is going to end nuclear testing. It's a real shock that they're just doing it. The US is not necessarily going to match this. They just step forward. And so we're really, I've never been able to figure out when you get a Cold War, do you heat a Cold War? You cold a Cold War? Anyways, what we're going to do is what he wants to do is to make sure that he can make the relationship with the US a little better so that he can transfer that money to the domestic economy, because this is the issue. The big problem he faces, though, is just after he's done this, in 1986, oil prices collapse. Now, oil prices had actually been very high in the 70s and coming into the early 80s. And Russia is a major world exporter. So they export oil, and it's one of their major parts of their budget. So just as Gorbachev has been able to bring down the military budget, they lose a huge set of the budget. They end up exactly where they were because there's still not enough money for the domestic economy because they've lost all this budget. So in the midst of all of this, Gorbachev also introduces two policies. So the first one is perestroika, which is restructuring. He says, you know what, these kind of 5-year plans that have been designed from the top are not working. So let's loosen the reins a bit at the top and allow workers and managers to decide how factories and things should work. So the second policy that he puts in place is glasnost. Now the idea is openness, and the idea was that newspapers should be allowed to print what's really happening. People should be able to assemble and really hear what's going on. Now the problem with this was that a lot of people knew that things weren't good in their little area, but the press had been controlled throughout the Soviet period. And so once you kind of open up and people figure out how bad things really are across the whole of the Soviet Union, that's going to make Gorbachev much less popular. So that's a real problem. We also begin to see a lot of strikes and other things happening that are okay under his openness policy, but again, are going to be pushing the government. So as we move into kind of 86, early 87, Russia has a major budget deficit. And so what it decides to do is to print money. Now, we've talked a bit about this in the past. This is never a good plan. If you rule the world, do not do this. So because when you print money, you get hyperinflation because people know the money isn't really worth anything. It does give you you can, make the paychecks for a single day, but it creates problems. That is going to lead to massive strikes throughout the Soviet Union because people know that the money they're being paid, not only have they not had raises in a while, but now their paychecks are worth even less because rarely, well, in fact, I cannot think of a case where incomes matched a hyperinflation situation. So people are making a lot less money. There also are food shortages in this period. There are not enough they're not producing enough crops. There are wheat shortages, which shouldn't happen in Russia. There just is not enough food on the shelves. People are having to stand in these huge long lines. Partially, they can't import much of anything because their money is basically worthless. And so economic growth in the Gorbachev era goes down and down and down. And as you can see in this slide, this is the real push as we go through the 80s. So 3% growth to 2%. So that 3% was up a little bit from the late Brezhnev years, but down to 1990, negative 8% growth. You don't ever want that. Again, you don't necessarily have to know much economics, but negative 8% economic growth is bad. And on top of that, it's going to get even worse by 1991 to negative 20%. This is a real economic collapse. And inflation is running 8% per month. Per month. I mean, 8% inflation per year is not good, but 8% inflation per month, this is insane. This is clearly not the communist utopia. No way. So at the same point in time, there's a major crisis in the Eastern Bloc states. And this is solidarity and things in Poland. Solidarity is a big workers' movement. But the issue for us here is that Poland decides to elect a non-communist prime minister, which is not supposed to be able to happen in the communist states. And basically everybody holds their breath to see what's going to happen. Will the Warsaw Pact interfere the way that had happened back in Czechoslovakia in 1968? Or what is going to happen? And Gorbachev does not order the Warsaw Pact troops in. And so when that happens, the other Eastern Bloc nations begin to move away from communism because they know they're not going to get invaded. Now, Gorbachev is trying to do negotiations to make sure this doesn't happen, but he never really sends troops to enforce this. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. That was that big wall that had divided Berlin, east and west, that had been put in the 60s. And basically, by January of 1990, every pro-Soviet government in the Eastern Bloc is gone. So the whole of the Eastern Bloc is not communist anymore. So the Soviet Union has lost control of all of that territory. In 1990, the USSR agrees to the reunification of Germany. So again, Gorbachev doesn't see really options. He definitely doesn't want to trigger any kind of major conflict with the US. In 1991, we get the Warsaw Pact dissolved. The country, obviously a pact that's supposed to protect communism when all of these countries don't have communist governments anymore is not going to work. And the Soviets begin to withdraw all their troops from Eastern Europe. Again, this is happening primarily without violence, which is shocking. I can remember I was in college when this was happening. I'm that old. And it just kind of seemed like every time you opened a newspaper, another big event had happened in the Soviet Union. And we went from as an average person, really fearing the Soviet Union, this monolith that was gonna, drop the bomb on us, to this just dissolving. And it was just crazy. Along with the fact that you weren't seeing these huge violent uprisings. So in addition to this, so the Eastern Bloc is gone. Then in addition to that, the individual Russian states begin to break from the USSR. Now, if you remember, the USSR, like the United States, is made up of a bunch of states. There are 15 of them in the USSR. And so what happens is those individual states begin leaving the USSR. So we start with Latvia and Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine. is the states you can see on the slide. They begin just saying, we're not going to be part of the Soviet Union. They initially say that their state laws have more power than federal laws, and then they begin just kind of ignoring the federal government. The biggest hit happens when Russia leaves the USSR. Now, Russia is the very largest republic, the very largest state in the Soviet Union. It's like the Alaska of the Soviet Union. And of course, it's the old heartland of the Russian Empire that became the USSR. So for that to go away is just really shocking. I guess in the United States, it would be as if all of the original 13 colonies left the US. I mean, it's just weird. It's the foundation of who we are. And so in December of 1991, Gorbachev resigns because we have a federal government with no states under it. There's only the federal government left. And so he resigns, and that's it. The USSR is gone. Doesn't exist. And where you had the USSR, you have these individual states, and Russia is one of those states. Now, I want to just emphasize a couple points here. One is that in the United States, when our President Reagan is in power, he's negotiating with Gorbachev. We saw Gorbachev as great. Here's this wonderful guy. Of course, we're going to bring democracy, and the U.S. is going to have influence, and the U.S. is going to win the Cold War. Woo, U.S. But in Russia, he is not fondly remembered. So, because this is an era of just chaos and problems. And for people who, as I'll talk about, look back to the Soviet Union as an era of prosperity, then Gorbachev is kind of seen as the one who destroyed it. He's the one who's in power, so people blame him. So for all the problems that are going to follow, people really blame Gorbachev. The second thing I do want to reemphasize, as I've already said, is that this really happened with very little violence. It is an amazing thing that this kind of perceived monolith that had control over all these countries and republics within the Soviet Union, and that you're able to see this collapse, and basically it's done peacefully on the whole. There are a few deaths, but on the whole, it is a very peaceful transition. And then Russia is left with, well, how is it going to move into the future?